Hey, I'm Thierry. I'm working in XWP and working with Google on the AMP project, or making sure that AMP works in WordPress and take advantage of the amazing library.
I am Alberto. I am part of the web content ecosystem team at Google, and our efforts are all directed to making the web better.
I'm Weston Reuter, CTO at XWP, and I work with these gentlemen on the AMP project and now PWA.
I'm Morten Brand Hendrickson. I'm a senior staff instructor at LinkedIn Learning, and I've worked with these guys and other people on developing a theme development rig for building progressive themes to support AMP and modern development practices.
Can you explain to a non-theme developer what are progressive themes and why they've become such an important topic lately?
Yeah, well, probably I can start answering that question to bringing up the notion of progressive web development, right? And, which means development of web applications using modern web technologies, modern web APIs, coding best practices, and performance best practices. So in that context, progressive themes are WordPress themes that adhere to all these principles, that are highly performant, highly usable, accessible, a pleasure to use, and so on, and compatible.
They use the new cutting edge technologies, but if your browser doesn't support them, they still work.
Correct. That's the notion of progressive.
Progressive part. Well, I think the interesting thing about these projects, there's multiple projects involved here, is that they all try to do something bigger than just individual projects, which is to take WordPress and use it as a vehicle to move the web forward, not just WordPress itself, by improving the coding practices, by improving the way WordPress functions, and that can be done through improving core and adding new features into core, which is something XWP and Google is working on, building plugins that help that happen, which is something they've done with the AMP plugin, and provided tools for theme developers to build better themes that follow modern best practices, which is what I've been working on with WP Rig. And they kind of fit together into this whole that pushes WordPress forward, pushes the developers forward, and pushes the web forward.
Okay, so that was my second question. What is the philosophy behind moving in the direction of progressive themes? How do these themes push the web forward?
I think in regards to adding things to add new capabilities to what a theme can do, it's also about limiting what a theme can do, because a lot of themes do a lot of bad things, and that's where AMP comes into the picture, I think, because a theme and plugins can add a lot of scripts that really slow down a site, and even just the core themes themselves. 2017 has a nav bar with a little link to scroll you down with smooth scrolling into the first section of the page, but that depends on two blocking JavaScripts just to be able to achieve that functionality, and AMP has that functionality built in, but it does so in a way that doesn't block the page at all. So I think that having progressive means both doing the new things but also discouraging the bad things.
Another angle that I like to look at is that at the most abstract level, it's all about user experience. It's like, how do we maximize the pleasure that our users get when they use our websites? So, and delightfulness in this context means things like performance, speed, having content that doesn't block. And then if you think about themes built according to those principles, then we are basically seeking user experience, awesome user experience in WordPress.
I think there are multiple initiatives like AMP and PWA to really make the web better, faster, more secure. And a role that we can play is making sure that WordPress is actually following these technologies and being for these technologies to be integrated in WordPress and taking advantage of it.
There's also the user aspect of it, right? Because the people that we design WordPress for, and we design plugins for, and themes for, and everyone, are the people who actually publish their own content onto the web. And there's a really valid question in how much should they need to know about how the web works to be able to publish some content, right? When they spin up a WordPress site, should we impose on them to know that, oh no, you need to add all these optimization plugins, and you need to do all this other stuff just to make the site work properly? And how much of that can be offloaded onto the theme itself, or plugins, or even WordPress core? And that's kind of where all these pieces fit together, is to fast forward a process that would take a very long time if it was only happening in WordPress core, by upgrading all the people who work on it at every level, all the way from site owners who can install plugins that do a better job, to theme developers who can build themes that do a better job, to the core developers who then have more room to, and best practice examples they can bake into core to make it work.
Okay. Do you remember several years ago, back when responsive themes became the industry standard, after mobile phone usage exploded, it was a watershed moment in WordPress theming history. Are we about to experience this again with progressive themes?
Yes. Well, I am the newcomer in the WordPress space in this group, but I do feel that the notion of progressiveness is going to mean that for the web in general, or like if you see the web ecosystem as a whole, the reason one of the reasons why we are pushing at Google the progressive technologies and advancing the web platform in that way is because the web needs to cross that boundary and becoming a platform that is competitive as compared to closed, or what is called closed garden or wall platforms, or native app, for example. So I believe that it's going to be a defining point in the future of WordPress, but I would like to hear the opinion of my colleagues.
I think the concept of progressive web apps is going to change a lot, and that's something that is being worked on. But these fine people next to me are working on the framework to make that happen in WordPress. You can already see it today in the WC EU app, which is a progressive web app. See how well that performs on the phone. And once PWA becomes something we can do in a uniform way in WordPress easily, it'll dramatically change how the web performs, because people who use their devices are more and more expecting the web to work the way their apps do. And PWAs do that. They actually take your website and turn it into something that behaves like an app on your phone, to blur the boundary between native app and web. And that in turn makes it easier for the people who have websites to create something that has an app-like experience without at the same time having to manage two separate code bases and do everything. And the second WordPress can do that out of the box without having to install a ton of plugins and do a bunch of customization, it will change everything. Because then PWA becomes something that you just expect instead of something that is a fancy thing some people have.
Maybe the way people understand progressive themes today doesn't really make sense, but ultimately to answer your question is, responsive was about solving problems and user needs when there was more and more different devices that people were viewing their content from. And in a sense, progressive is the same. So for example, there are people who now want to be able to edit offline, and PWA brings these functionalities. So it's about solving closing the gap and making sure that WordPress continues growing and offering these kind of capabilities.
Okay, I recently saw a core ticket created by Weston for adding support for web app manifests. Is this something that WordPress needs in order to support more widespread adoption of progressive themes?
Progressive web apps specifically require HTTPS, service workers, and app manifests to be installed as progressive web apps on a phone or Chromebook, or coming to Mac and Windows. So those technologies all play together, and AMP also, I think, plays an important role there as well, because if you want to have an app-like experience, you want to have, in a website, you want to have a single-page application experience where you have an app shell that you're clicking around your site, and the content, you're not doing a full-page refresh every single time you navigate around. And in order to do that safely, you need to have content that behaves safely and predictably, and that's what AMP provides, where all the content is encapsulated with a set of components, and so you can safely take the content out from one page and swap it out with content from another page, and you can know that it's not going to blow up the page or have certain dependencies on scripts that aren't there. And so I think the AMP content foundation combined with the progressive web app service worker manager on top of it will meet nicely in the middle in a progressive web app experience in WordPress.
And it is true that one of the features that web app manifest enable that is the add to home screen capability, right? So you install the web app in your phone. May not be needed for some WordPress sites, right? But it's part of that big picture that Weston mentioned.
I think the real question is, why does this need to be in core and not as a plugin?
Well, that's an interesting question especially for service workers. I mean, that having an API in core will really help avoiding conflicts, and that's probably one of the biggest problems with plugins now. There are plugins using and installing service workers, but when there are more than one plugin doing that, when there's more than one plugin, that there is conflicts, and that's probably the problem. So This is one of the really key point, I think, is having an API in core where plugins can actually leverage this API, take advantage of installing one service worker obviously, and avoid conflict.
And what you said, and what Weston said also, that together with HTTPS and service workers and web app manifest, the three are essential. They go together. So if we add service workers API to core and HTTPS all around, but we don't add web app manifest, if the person doesn't have the plugin installed, then we are out of luck.
Okay. Who is currently making progressive themes, and how quickly do you expect the commercial theme market to adapt to this?
Okay, I could start answering the question. Picking up what Morten said, that the notion of progressive, at the core, is the notion of progressive enhancement, right? So if you think about it, going back to the definition of progressive web development, it's the development of web apps using coding best practices, performance best practices, and modern web APIs. If you do any piece of that picture a little bit, you are in the progressive web app road. So in many ways, there are many progressive themes being built today. One of the problems that is happening is that there's a lot of fragmentation. For example, there's a lot of plugins that are using service workers, but in their own ways. As Thierry mentioned, you cannot have, or there is a big risk of having two service workers installed in the same site because there can be collisions. So there is a movement happening. What we want is to say, this is the best way to do this is a uniform API to do it, and then enable progressive theme developers to take advantage of the core functionality. And the second part of the question was how
long before the commercial market really gets on board with this?
You guys?
How long is a tough question, I think, but I would say that it also depends on how much effort is put onto this as a community. So, like Alberto said, there are good initiatives. Our goal is to empower people to be able to take advantage of this and start building progressive themes. But then there's also the adoption part, and that's how people react to it. Big effort from the community, also WordPress.org commitment to doing this together. So giving a timeline is really hard, but I don't quote anybody on this. I hope that by WordCamp US we'll start seeing more adoption and this topic to grow.
I think there are already commercial themes that do these progressive technologies, but they have to be all in one. You can't have plugins added to the mix. If you have a single page application doing with its own service worker, they can't have their own service worker added to the mix because you only have one install at a time. And the plugins can't work together. They'll be conflicting, like you said. So that's the goal, to have a common API for service workers so that plugins and themes can each install their own logic, just like they can enqueue their own scripts today. Also be able to enqueue their own service workers, and then core can manage the combination of them, as well as having a common app manifest that plugins and themes can collaborate on and have a single output into the page.
Yeah.
This is also where the project I'm working on, WP Rig, came about. It was this idea that right now, if you go to any theme developer here at the event or anywhere in the world and you say, where do you start? They will say, you know, they start with one of a myriad of starter themes, and then they use some sort of build process, and it could be any kind of build process, something they built themselves, something they found somewhere, but the result is you get a million different ways of doing the same thing. And some of it is great, and some of it is not great, and some of it is somewhere in between. And a lot of time is spent on just figuring out how to put the pieces together so that you can make anything work. So when Alberto approached me at WordCamp US last year in 2017 and said, hey, what if we build a starter theme that's more than a starter theme, that's actually a build process that allows people to take advantage of a lot of the new functionality that exists in the web platform without necessarily having to figure out how to put all the pieces together. So WP Rig gives you the platform to build a progressive theme that uses all the latest performance best practices and WordPress best practices and checks your code for coding standards. And like, there's a bunch of stuff that you should be doing anyway in a convenient package. And then over time, the thinking is it'll evolve with these new progressive technologies. So as the PWA functionality comes online in a feature plugin, WP Rig will follow along to then hook into it early on to show the best practice for how to implement it, so that people who want to get started doing this has a new starting point where a lot of the heavy lifting has been taken away and they can focus on just getting the theme to work the way they want rather than learning everything they need to know to get it to be, you know, meeting these latest standards.
Yeah, I would like to add one thing, if I may, because all these pieces that were said here are very important. We are doing a lot of work from the engineering standpoint. Morten is also doing a lot of work on terms of education. We are also doing work on advocacy, so we are talking a lot about things. We are presenting, we are giving speeches, writing blog posts, and that's where main WordPress players like WP Tavern can also be part of this picture, right? Because we need to rally the community. I think that we are after the same goals. So WordPress thinks about democratizing web publishing. We are after democratizing awesome user experiences. And this is a responsibility of all of us in the community to achieve it, right? If we all agree that it's important for the future.
Okay, so let's move on to AMP. What specifics are required for making a theme compatible with AMP? Right now, a lot of it's done through plugins. How long before AMP compatibility is an influential factor when purchasing a WordPress theme?
So, yeah, to add AMP compatibility today, well, the AMP plugin 1.0 alpha version allows you to turn on AMP for your existing theme without having to do anything. And the experience that you get with that is essentially like you are browsing the site with JavaScript disabled. So as long as the theme is coded in a way that it falls back to having a no script fallbacks, then it's going to work just out of the box. So that's the baseline. And then for the core themes, including 2017, 2016, and 2015, the AMP plugin includes support for the JavaScript specific features that are included with those themes. For example, toggling the nav menu on mobile, like when you click the menu button, or the sticky nav menu on 2017 when you scroll down the page. So those things, there are AMP solutions to those, and with a little bit of education, I think that they can become commonplace. But I think that and there's also a pull request open right now for underscores, so that anybody can use that as a starting point, as well as WP Rig for AMP. So yeah, I think that anybody can get started now. It's very easy to do to get started with AMP in a theme. And the goal of the AMP plugin is to allow you to develop WordPress themes the WordPress way. So you shouldn't have to learn anything new. You just have to unlearn some things, like using JavaScript all over the place to do things that should be done in PHP instead.
Yeah, exactly, or 300 kilobytes of CSS. And something important to say is that when we started working on this project last year, we divided the project in phases. And right now we are starting the current phase with a very strong component of adoption, and that adoption, one of the part is like working with theme marketplaces, theme authors, saying, listen, if we use things like WP rig or enhanced underscores, or if you do this methodology enabled by the plugin, you could get your theme uncompatible very easily. So that's one avenue. The other avenue is then like, well, plugin makers see very similar to what is happening with Gutenberg, right? Do we all agree that performance is a worthy goal? So why don't we work all together to make your plugin uncompatible? And part of our job in this engineering effort is to facilitate that, enable that, working with the community to achieve that. That's our goal.
I think you asked how long before we see commercial themes and being AMP compatible. And if we look at what happened in the theme industry, is suddenly there was more and more themes, and obviously a lot of premium themes, and it became very crowded. And people have been finding ways to actually create themes for specific niche and specific needs and things like that. And I think that now that the AMP plugin allows or make the integration easier, I think that theme authors are going to actually start focusing on creating themes specifically for AMP and actually developing more features around it. So it's still very new. I would say there was a huge push in the past few months to actually really take where the plugin was, and really now giving the ability to create full featured websites in AMP paid mode or native mode. And that's just the 1.0 alpha was released last week. Last week. So it's still the beginning of the journey, and the journey is very long. But I think we are right now at the turning point in the AMP plugin where people are actually going to start focusing on building cool things.
The neat thing about how this works right now is because of how WordPress works and how the AMP plugin works and everything. As a theme developer, you can now hook in and figure out whether or not the AMP plugin is currently active. And then you can build a theme where if there is no AMP plugin active, the theme does its thing. And then if the plugin is activated, you can detect that and then change the behavior of the theme to take advantage of AMP features and build them in. Because in the end, the theme developer is not the person who gets to choose whether or not AMP is activated on the site. That's the end user. And as developers, our responsibility is to make a theme that will work with whatever decisions that the end user makes. So Weston has been helping me in WP Rig to figure out how to set this up in such a way that once people start developing themes, it's easy for them to extend it to also support AMP and give that unified user experience regardless of what the end user decides to do in terms of the plugin, and hand that power over to the end user to say, like, I'm comfortable clicking this. So when I think people will start seeing the value in this once they realize that they can extend the functionality of their themes on top of this plugin, and that it won't stand in the way of the functionality. And they realize that it is not our job as developers to decide whether or not people get to use a plugin. It's our job to facilitate whatever they decide to do. And this is one of the few plugins where facilitating actually can be enhancing the experience within the theme framework without destroying other things in the process.
Okay, so the last one is about Gutenberg. How will themes need to change in order to be Gutenberg compatible?
Specifically for AMP or anything?
Just to be able to advertise themselves as a Gutenberg compatible theme, what specifics are we looking at?
There's certain add theme support calls to enable certain features like full bleed and full width images, things like that, color schemes, and there's a few things like that.
Some of it is like, if you take a theme that was written 5 years ago, so Gutenberg was not a thing that existed, and you activate Gutenberg, it works. I mean, you get blocks and everything. You don't get any of the flashy stuff, right? But you can add your images and you can make some column stuff and everything, because Gutenberg sideloads CSS into the front end if you don't do anything to it. But as a theme developer, you can then say, no, wait a second. Like Weston said, I want to introduce these new content lists, and you do that by just adding theme support for width. And then you can say, I want to custom or control which colors people can use when they're working in the editor, and you can add a schema for that. And you can start extending into other features if you want to. So it becomes more of a the plugin developer or the theme developer gets to decide how much of Gutenberg do I want to adopt, and then Gutenberg will attempt to sideload in the rest and try to get it to work, right? So you don't have to do much, but you do need to do something to get the basic selling points of Gutenberg to work. Like Gutenberg is being sold on the idea of these full width images. That's something you have to add into your theme to get it to work, because you need to know that it actually works and looks okay before you can ship your theme, right?
In the future, though, with Gutenberg moving beyond just editor to full site customization, themes are going to have to change a lot. And templates are going to be no longer a bunch of imperative PHP statements that are thrown together into a PHP file. It's going to be much more, it's going to need to be much more declarative, where your templates are just an array of nested blocks that you then can rearrange in the admin. So then, yeah, it's going to be a very different way, potentially, of doing themes in the future. But for right now, all you need to know is what we just said.
Gutenberg is this very interesting phenomenon, right? Because you have, right now, it is an editor replacement. And everyone knows that that is like, the second that ships, it's going to change into something else immediately. And I think for people who come to the WordPress community or are already in the community who have crazy ideas about how WordPress should work, this is the time to start contributing, because you actually will have influence as to how this happens, because none of us really have a clear understanding of what happens to WordPress once you have blocks you can move around. And like Matt said in just an hour ago, that we can't really see where that is because we don't even know what it looks like yet. And that means everyone gets to be part of that conversation, and everyone gets to think openly about how WordPress can work. And some of that will become what WordPress is. And that's why, open source matters, because we can all contribute. And this isn't something that requires you knowing React at this point, because once we start talking about a theme in the Gutenberg as block editor space, we're talking about rethinking everything that WordPress does in the front end from the ground up. So if you can draw boxes on a piece of paper, you have something worth sharing with the community about how you think this should be happening.
I think, interestingly, right now, especially plugin authors, Gutenberg is really focused on the admin side, and I feel that a lot of people have been also looking at how they can replace the meta box, the fields and things like that in Gutenberg, and the focus has been a lot on that for now, and not so much in the front end. But I think when this is going to be done and people are going to, Gutenberg will be adopted, then people are going to start leveraging more capabilities from Gutenberg, and it's going to impact the front end more than what it is today. So there is an adoption phase that's first focusing on the admin, and potentially later on more on the front end.
Yeah. And with the topic of AMP compatibility and Gutenberg compatibility for themes, there is a very interesting. I find Gutenberg extremely fascinating because it's based on this simple idea of the block, and it maps the concept of web components that is very powerful. And AMP is a web component library, which is actually, there is a direct synergy between Gutenberg blocks and AMP components, and we are part of our focus today and for the future is making sure that we have AMP compatible Gutenberg blocks that can be used to create AMP compatible themes and AMP compatible everything.
What's interesting is if we look at all these projects, so PWA, AMP, Gutenberg, it's an innovation, and then there is a switch that needs to happen. And I think what can be really interesting is that we can actually learn from each project and how does the transition phase happens for Gutenberg. There's a user adoption phase, learning, gathering information. In AMP, on the project, we're actually experiencing exactly the same, getting it out there, getting information, how people are using it, improving the features, making it more accessible and easier to work with. And PWA will be the same, and any thing related to progressive themes, I think, will follow. So I feel that there's going to be a lot of learning, and we're going to become more experienced on moving forward faster from these common projects or related projects.
And we have the WordPress community behind us, so we are safe.